Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor Jon V. Kofas is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
Hello everyone, welcome to an analytical session, a synoptic perspective on the 30th anniversary of the genocide, the first of its kind in post-World War II Europe, that took place in July 1995. This year, this July of 2025 is the 30th anniversary. Just a word about the term genocide. It is a term which means crimes against humanity, which includes ethnic cleansing, and it's characterized by the UN Geneva Convention of 1949 as a deliberate attempt by a state. We'll talk about non-state actors as well, by a state to eliminate or reduce a population of a specific race, ethnic, or religious group background. And of course, in 1949, the UN framers of the convention had in mind the Holocaust that took place in Nazi Germany with Jewish victims. The Geneva Convention and the term genocide, although historically genocide, and even before the Geneva Convention of 1949, there were genocides going back to ancient times, by the way, from actually the Peloponnesian Wars, wars between Athens and Sparta, to the Roman Republic and Empire and so forth. Historically, the perpetrators of genocide have been states. They have the means, the large military, they have the ability to carry out the mass extermination of people. Now, the fact is, however, that the United Nations and international law do not confine this term genocide to simply state actors. They do include non-state actors, and that has been on rare occasions, because usually the term that is used for non-state actors is terrorism, unconventional warfare. The reason I'm mentioning this, and this is an important reason, is because especially in the Western media in the last 3 years, ever since October actually of 2023, when Israel launched a campaign in Gaza against civilians, their argument was it was against Hamas, but the victims were unarmed men, women, and children. The media and Western governments for all this time, to this day, by the way, because I recently saw an article in the BBC where they refuse to use the term genocide, as the International Criminal Court has attributed this term, and the United Nations, various sub-agencies of the United Nations have used this term to apply to the case of Israel, and instead use it for non-state actors, like I said, in this case, in the case of Israel, for Hamas, for example. So they have no problem attaching that term to non-state actors, but they do have a problem with state actors. Today, I'm going to focus primarily on Srebrenica, which is a town in the northeast of Bosnia Herzegovina, what became the free state of Bosnia-Herzegovina after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, and Yugoslavia, of course, which was one, became 7 different republics. But because there are parallels between what happened in Srebrenica and what has happened in Gaza in the last 3 years, and because the International Court and the United Nations have deemed that both of those do come under the heading of genocide, by the way, regardless of whether the United States and Western media and Western governments do not recognize that for Israel. I should tell you, by the way, that European governments in the last few days have announced plans to commemorate the tragedy of Bosnia-Herzegovina, the slaughter of Muslims, the genocide of Muslims in this small town right on the border between Serbia and Bosnia-Herzegovina 30 years ago. And they have done so. Even some have made statements already. For example, I saw on BBC the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom make a speech about the tragedy in Srebrenica 30 years ago. All along, of course, what a number of his own Labour Party members pointed out is that he made this speech against genocide 30 years ago, while the United Kingdom in the last 3 years has been supplying weapons to Israel, enabling it to carry genocide in Gaza, the war in Gaza against unarmed civilians. Now, the United States, I have looked at, and maybe I haven't seen it, but I have looked for any evidence of commemorating, officially, the US commemorating the tragedy in Europe, because the US, as we'll see, was involved. This was during the Clinton administration. Bill Clinton was the president. Richard Holbrooke, who was, I believe at the time, he was US ambassador to Germany, but he was the point man for the Balkans, for this region, for the conflict, one of the key players in the State Department for this. The US has not, have not seen anything by the State Department about commemorating. There may be, today's July 10th, tomorrow is the 11th, it's the official commemoration. I should tell you, just for the sake of, since I'm a historian and sometimes not a stickler for dates, but actually the slaughter began, the Serbian nationalist Orthodox Christians began to move in against the Muslims in this small town in Bosnia-Herzegovina on the 6th of July, and they were slowly moving in with the full knowledge, of course, of Western governments, and with the intent, of course, to eliminate many of them. And it culminated in the 11th of July slaughter, but it dragged on until the 16th of July. So really, it was much of the month of July. So we may yet see something out of the United States in terms of a commemoration of this. I should tell you that instead, the State Department, instead of having something that at least I haven't seen, on Srebrenica, it did have an announcement on the United Nations Special Rapporteur, who is known worldwide. Her name is she's of Italian background, Francesca Albanese. Francesca Albanese has been the lady who has put together the reports on genocide in Palestinian lands, and specifically in Gaza. And she has been an ardent supporter of the International Criminal Court. And the State Department decided to sanction her on the anniversary of the Srebrenica genocide. Now, they do state, and I found this rather curious, that one of the main reasons, they listed the number of them, one of the main reasons they sanctioned her, which means banning her from coming to the into the US, and also confiscating any assets she may have in the US. They cited, well, she is a supporter of the ICC. Well, obviously, the ICC, by the way, was founded in Francesca Albanese's home country in Italy in 2002. Italy was the main sponsor of the creation of the ICC. It is her job. The reason that the United Nations appointed her as the rapporteur is to monitor what is actually going on and to report. Now, what really bothers the Trump administration, I should tell you, is that a few weeks ago, I don't recall exactly when, but recently, Albanese put out a report that the major corporations, most of them US, but global corporations, by the way, many of them from all over the world, have been profiting, war profiteering, in other words, from the genocide in Gaza. She then proceeded, according to reports, to write a few letters to CEOs explaining to them that according to international law, what is going on there is really a war. It's a situation of war crimes committed, and that they should rethink their policy of profiting from such conditions. That is more to the point, considering, by the way, that if we put this together with how the Trump administration simultaneously announced that it will punish the Lula government of Brazil, a progressive government, labor government in Brazil, for trying to go after former president of Brazil, who was authoritarian neoliberal, like pretty much like Trump, like Modi in India, others like Erdogan in Turkey and so forth, that unless Brazil stops the legal pursuit of Jair Bolsonaro, the US will impose on Brazil 50% tariff to punish Brazil, not because Brazil has a surplus trade with the US, because it doesn't, it has a deficit. One of the few countries on the planet that actually has a deficit with the United States, not a surplus like China. And the US government is to punish them, not for economic reasons, but a government going the legal route of trying to see exactly what methods of corruption it can expose through the courts of the previous regime, the authoritarian neoliberal regime of Jair Bolsonaro. So when you put this together, what you have is a political decision, both in terms of the US policy, US foreign policy toward Brazil, toward the Lula regime, as well as the disdain that the US has, of course, toward the ICC, and using, and by the way, sanctioning, the US has sanctioned the ICC, and it is not a member of the ICC, by the way, although whenever it wants to use the ICC, in the past, it has used the ICC, it has pressed the ICC, for example, in the case during the Biden administration, to declare Vladimir Putin a war criminal because of what he did in Ukraine with the invasion in beginning 2022. So, although not a member, right? In this case, though, sanctions on the ICC, right? The duplicity is glaring. It's very obvious. Sanctions on the ICC because it made its decision on declaring the prime minister of the current prime minister of Israel, as well as the former defense minister, were criminals. So, and then it finds Albanese, who pursues this line and asks multinational corporations not to contribute to genocide by cooperating commercially with Israel and facilitating genocide. It finds Albanese. It decides that Albanese must be sanctioned, and all of this taking place on the 30th anniversary of the genocide in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Now, let me move on with some of the specifics. It is, as I said, the official date is 11 July 1995, but actually it was much of the month of July, from the 6th of July onwards, although Western governments knew, even as we'll see, even before that, that the Serbs, the Serbian nationalists who were anti-Muslim, would move in and slaughter the people of who were in a United Nations safe zone in Srebrenica. And they did so. They killed some 8,372 adult males and some boys. And then there was a mass exodus, forced exodus of the rest of the population. This took place under the watchful eye of Western governments. Now, how did all this begin? The United States, the country of Yugoslavia did not exist before 1918. In fact, the Balkan region had come under the control of the Ottoman Empire when the Ottoman Empire conquered the Byzantine Empire, seizing Constantinople in 1453, in the middle of the 15th century, and then slowly expanding throughout the Middle East, and of course taking all of the Balkans. And the finding that the only major rival was the Austrian Empire. Eventually, the Northern Balkans remain predominantly Christian, Orthodox, with some Catholics. For example, the former Yugoslavia had a number of Catholics, but also a number of Balkan people converted to Islam. Okay. And specifically, this was the case with the area with what became the Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The scholars who have looked at this point out that, and the history of this, and I had years ago, I believe in the late 90s, I was on the dissertation committee of a young man who was doing his PhD dissertation in Chicago, and he was of Croatian background, and he did it on the crimes against humanity that took place in Bosnia and Herzegovina against Muslims. And the tragedy here is he himself, being Croatian, could not understand how it was that there was such unity of all the Southern Slavs, Yugoslav people, because this is a very heterogeneous area with Catholics, Orthodox, Muslims, people of various ethnic backgrounds, but all held together, not when the Republic was founded, the Yugoslav Republic was founded in 1918 after World War I, but rather really after World War II, when Tito, Josip Broz Tito, who was a Marxist resistance leader against the Nazis in the 1940s and emerged the leader for life until his death in 1980. Under Tito, who was neither pro-Soviet nor pro-West, he was non-aligned. He kept the balance between East and West. Yugoslavia, not so much because he was such a genius, although he was a very astute politician, by the way, but because during the Yalta Conference between Churchill, Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin in 1945 in Yalta, in the Crimea, this is a Crimean resort, they agreed on the division of Europe, East and West. Eastern Europe would go under the Soviet influence, given its contribution to World War II. The West would go from Greece onward, would go to the US sphere of influence. And Yugoslavia, in fact, they decided 50-50. And Yugoslavia actually, that model fit very well as far as Tito was concerned, because he really wanted that, provided an advantage for him. And he struck a tone of independence, if you will, becoming a leader of the non-aligned group back then, along with Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Nasser in Egypt, among others, Nehru in India. So Yugoslavia was held tightly together because of Tito, because he transcended, the cult of personality was so powerful, and he transcended all these ethnic and religious rivalries and the divisions. He brought all these people together, and he held them together. He was the catalyst to unity in Yugoslavia. Once he died in 1980, what happened in 1980? Two things. Number one, the Soviet Union begins to show serious structural signs of collapse. And the entire Soviet bloc, from Poland all the way down to Yugoslavia. So he dies in 1980, and the decade of the 1980s is the decade of glasnost and perestroika during the presidency of the Soviet leader, the last Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was looking around for some kind of a transition, and he finally decided on the breakup of the Soviet, the entire Soviet bloc. And Yugoslavia found itself in the same situation. What happened is the ideology of communism and Titoism that held Yugoslavia together was replaced immediately by nationalism, which divided people, ethnic divisions, and by religious divisions. Muslims were the least tolerated, especially by the Orthodox, by the Serb Orthodox. Bosnia-Herzegovina, one of the 7 republics that became independent, was majority Muslim by a very small percentage. I think it was 51-52% were Muslims. Less than 30% were Serb Orthodox, and the balance were Croats Catholic. So you have a heterogeneous population here. And this population is, especially the Serbs, they vow that they will not be under the tutelage of Muslim rule. They do not accept the Muslims. Although they're a minority, they reject the Muslims. And this is when the problems began, because fanatics began to emerge. And I'll mention the 3 top leaders, because there were a number of them. 45 in total were actually indicted and went to prison. But there were a number of fanatics who sought extreme measures, including, of course, the ultimate crime of genocide. The journalists and scholars today are pointing out that there are some parallels between that situation in the 1990s, when the Yugoslav Republic broke up into 7 different separate republics, and with the situation in Israel. The fact is, of course, there are also a lot of differences. The Israelis were mostly Europeans, Eastern Europeans at that, who came and were welcomed by the Palestinians in the 1940s, and then went into an unconventional warfare. Let's call it what many scholars call it, terrorist acts, unconventional warfare against the Palestinian majority in order to seize that land and make it their own, as part of a 19th century Zionist dream that they had called Lebensraum, which is a German word meaning Lebensraum means living space in German, living space. The Greater Israel concept, the concept of Greater Israel. So from 1948 on, the minority becomes the ruling group that begins to dehumanize the majority, the Palestinians. It was exactly the same way with the Bosnian Serbs, supported, of course, by Serbia, the Republic of Serbia, who demonized and dehumanized the Muslims. And the first thing that historically, again, going back to ancient times to the present, that those who commit crimes against humanity do is they dehumanize and demonize the other side, making them appear, although they are the victims, they make them appear as the villains. And the patterns are very similar. Now, in the post-war period, according to scholarly articles and books about crimes against humanity, much of when we look at the geography on this planet, much of the what we would call crimes against humanity, much of that has been taking place in the global south, and many of those victims happen to be Muslim. Okay, whether in Srebrenica, whether in Bosnia and Herzegovina, whether in Palestine, whether the Rohingya in Myanmar, whether in Xinjiang province, the Uyghurs, who are Turkish Muslims, although that has been controversial and debatable. So we have a situation of a Muslim, or some call it an Islamophobia, mass hysteria on a world scale, which was intensified after the revolution of Iran in 1979, when the Ayatollah Khomeini comes back to Iran. The Shah is overthrown, and Iran decided, this is 1979, there was still a Soviet Union, it's not in favor of the Soviet Union, but it's not in favor of the West. It strikes an independent course, and it definitely decided that it was against the United States and Israel. And unlike the Arab countries that were quietly in a rapprochement mode diplomatically toward Israel, the Ayatollah Khomeini and the mullahs in Iran, the Islamic Republic, take it upon themselves to forge alliances with specific groups, from Hezbollah that developed slowly in the 1980s in Lebanon, to Hamas in Gaza, to the Houthi rebels in Yemen. So they forged these alliances with groups, all of them having in common the common enemy, the United States and Israel. So this was the situation which the West looked at then collectively Muslims as jihadists, okay? And the fact is that historically the West carries, I should point out, I did mention it already, I'm a historian. I used to teach history of Western civilization. There is a crusader mentality in the Western world from the 11th century onward, the late 11th century onward, with the crusades sanctioned by the Vatican, by the papacy, to go into Muslim lands, seize them, and fight the infidel, namely the Muslims. There is that legacy of crusaders embedded in the ideology of the West. That is continuing. It was intensified. It was intensified after the revolution of 1979 in Iran. Now, and it's interesting that what we see in Srebrenica among Serbian nationalists, whether they're in Bosnia Serbs or in the Republic, is that same spirit that they will revenge the Ottoman Muslim control of the Balkans of 500 years ago. Well, that's when that started, when they took over Constantinople, now called obviously Istanbul, which actually means the same thing in Turkish. But in any case, so there is this spirit, this crusader spirit that prevails, and it's common among Westerners, and it's targeting Muslims. This is not to say, this is just at the ideological level. This is not to say that this is the driving force. Geopolitical and geoeconomic interests were really prevalent both in the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, as I'll explain very shortly, as well as in Israel. Obviously, Israel has its own agenda, the Lebensraum view, the Greater Israel view, take as much land away, not just from Palestinians, but also neighboring Muslim countries, to create some Greater Israel, become the dominant power at the regional level, determining the balance of power, not allowing any Muslim country, whether it's Saudi Arabia or Iran, although it won in the last couple of decades, it has really tried to forge an alliance with Saudi Arabia against Iran, try to take them out at least. Before that, it was Iraq, of course, convincing the United States to go after Iraq, which dragged the U.S. into a war against Iraq on the pretense of weapons of mass destruction. That was driven in large measure by Israel, although nobody forced George Bush's hand to go into war against Iraq. Israel did play a role. So we have a complicated situation here with Israel having a plan of its own for geopolitical and geoeconomic reasons, by the way, wanting to be, competing to be the regional economic and geopolitical power, all right, and determining the balance of power with the back of the West, especially the United States, but using ideology, using the Islamophobia issue, the Muslim boogeyman, if you will, in order to accomplish all of this. It has to demonize the other side. It has to make them out to be horrible, deserving of the fate that they have. This is the same spirit that prevailed in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the 1990s. Now, scholars point out that there are some very interesting similarities and differences. As I said, one of the similarities is that in both cases, in both Srebrenica in July 1995, during the massacre there, which of course the United Nations and International Court labeled genocide, as well as in Gaza, what we have is the West claiming to support human rights while violating international law. That's very important. Very important. The rhetoric is that the West is embracing democracy, liberal democracy, it's embracing human rights, while the policies prove something entirely different. This is an important component here, because ultimately everyone, whether it's human beings, you and I, or institutions, governments, and so forth, are not judged by rhetoric, but rather by deeds, but what we do. And the deeds of the Western world, both in Srebrenica and in Gaza, speak for themselves. It doesn't, even if the International Criminal Court had not issued warrants of arrest for Israeli officials, even if Francesca Albanese never existed, would the facts on the ground be any different? They would be exactly the same. Nothing alters them. These are people. Francesca Albanese is simply recording. She's like a newspaper. She's like a secretary. She's recording. She's someone with a brilliant mind, by the way, but she's recording what is taking place. And she's going to the roots, to the institutional roots of this, and to the complex layers of what it takes to have a situation of genocide in Israel. And it was no different in 30 years ago in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, in the case of Bosnia Herzegovina, the war convictions, 45 of them, with the three major players: Slobodan Milosevic, the president of the Yugoslav Republic, Radovan Karadzic, and who was the Bosnian Serbian, who really was the mastermind, and then Mladić, who was also the executioner in this, Ratko Mladić, who was the executioner of the during the July massacre. These three, but there were actually a total of 45. All of them got 700 years in prison collectively. Not one person has received this kind of punishment in the case of the other international ICC, the International Criminal Court decision with regard to crimes against humanity in Gaza. So that is a very important distinction there. Now, I want to give you a very brief overview of the events in Srebrenica. In September 1991, the United Nations Security Council, made up of the 5 permanent members and the 9 rotating, recognized that there would be problems in the 7 breakup nations of the former Yugoslav Republic. They wanted to prevent violence, at least in theory, this was the logic, and they agreed that there should not be weapons, at least officially. Clandestinely, that's another issue. There should not be weapons sales, because it would only exacerbate the conflict among the ethnic minorities within the 7 breakup republics, as conflicts did break out after September 1991, in fact, the following year, in various parts, including Bosnia-Herzegovina, because the minority populations resisted on who exactly would take over and how much power, who would have how much power. The idea of sounds fair enough and just enough to not to have weapons exports, and it's fine and dandy, except that the Serbs had the most weapons and had access to the factories making the weapons throughout the former Yugoslav republics. while this UN Security Council decision left the Muslims powerless, defenseless. The United Nations knew that. They decided then to create safe zones. They created a number of safe zones within Bosnia-Herzegovina. And one, besides Sarajevo, one of the capital, one of the major areas was, or the major towns, was the border town up in the northeast, Srebrenica, which had about 9,000 people. And once it became a safe area and the conflict broke out in 92 in Bosnia-Herzegovina between Muslims and the Orthodox Serbs, a lot of Muslims moved up to the safe town because the UN assured them this would be safe for them. That's what a safe town is. Besides, the United Nations placed troops up there, 300 or so, 300 to 400. They were Dutch. They were from Holland, and they were under the United Nations flag. So the population went from 9,000 to 43,000. Clearly, did not have the infrastructure to support such a large population, but people were afraid for their lives, so they fled there. And ultimately, by the way, that's where the massacre took place, in the safe zone of the UN. This is one reason that the UN, in commemorating the Srebrenica, the 30th anniversary of the slaughter, makes mention of this, of the failure of the UN to protect these people, just as the UN has failed to protect the people, the innocent civilians in Gaza in the last 3 years from the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, coming at them from all sides and preventing them, by the way, from having access to food, water, utilities, everything, and destroying. Most of the housing is utterly destroyed. Gaza is a parking lot. Everyone in the age of the internet and instant photographs and videos, unlike the 1990s in Srebrenica today, although, by the way, the CIA and European intelligence actually had from NATO aerial photographs, operations, the NATO airplanes flying over Srebrenica, they were photographing. They knew exactly what was taking place on the ground. They knew what was taking place on the ground in that town. Today, however, we have instant photographs and instant video, and we know there is no way to hide. The only thing you can do is really sanction the International Criminal Court and anyone who, like Albanese, who supports the court and who works for the United Nations in support for universal human rights, by the way. The tragedy of Srebrenica is somewhat similar to the tragedy of Gaza, insofar as there is collective responsibility of the Western world here. It's that simple. There is collective responsibility of the Western world. Unlike Gaza, the United States was not at the head. It was a player during the Clinton administration, but not really calling the shots. It was France, the UK, Germany, much, much more important, insofar as they were interested in the geopolitical control of the entire Balkan region, by the way, not just former Yugoslav republics. They wanted them to become part of NATO, to be basically supportive and become members and contribute to NATO's defense. And but they also wanted them to remain dependent on Western manufactured goods and exporters of raw materials. In other words, continue the underdevelopment that had started during the Ottoman era, because one of my former mentors who worked at Northwestern University in Chicago and then moved on to the University of California, San Diego, argued in his one of his brilliant books, Global Rift, The Third World Comes of Age, that the Balkans were underdeveloped by an underdeveloped power, namely the Ottoman Empire. Underdevelopment, by the way, is a process just like development. The Europeans deliberately use the Balkans and continue to use the Balkans. They regard the Balkans, Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, as the periphery of the European core of the capitalist world economy. And as it's there to buttress NATO, to buttress geopolitically Northwest Europe, and to support it economically. It's not to be self-sufficient, to develop like Northwest Europe. That's not its role. And so they had plans for that. In fact, the bombing of certain parts of the former Yugoslav republics, certain areas, factories. Why would you bomb factories? Car factories, for example. Well, they are. They make jeeps. They make vehicles that could be used for anything, everything, and anything that is in the civilian economy is used for the benefit of the military. So, in any case, the biggest culprit in the Srebrenica massacre was the Northwest European Corps, with the United States having, however, a large voice during the Clinton administration, because as we found out by State Department officials after Bill Clinton finished his term as his two-term presidency, and people started writing books and giving interviews and having articles, U.S. priority in Bosnia-Herzegovina and the former republics of Yugoslavia were geopolitical and geoeconomic, and of course giving priority to, on the geoeconomic front, to the Europeans, to the Northwest Europeans, with the U.S. taking a back seat on that score. It was not to stop ethnic cleansing. Let me put it very, very plainly. Former State Department officials have said that was not a priority for us. Geopolitics and geoeconomics was a priority. Okay? This, of course, is a tragedy to readily admit this, because ethnic cleansing, according to the United Nations Geneva Convention of 1949, is a war crime. This is not some minor infraction of the law. This is a major violation of international law, and the West has a major responsibility all along. And I don't want to go through the history year by year from 1992 until the Dayton Accords at the end of 1995, when finally hostilities were ended in the region. The West knew exactly what was going on. Even when the Dutch UN forces in Srebrenica said, look, the Serbs, the Serbian nationalists from Bosnia are coming. They are more than likely coming to slaughter the Muslims. We need reinforcements. No reply. They ignored that. The French Foreign Ministry, the German Foreign Ministry, the British Foreign Ministry, the State Department were all aware that genocide or some kind of massacre, I don't want to say genocide, some kind of massacre, because genocide is a term, a technical term, but this was a massacre. Some kind of massacre was going to take place. Why? Because just like the Israeli officials in the last 3 years, many Israeli officials who go public, they have no apologies to make about saying, we want the Palestinians out of Gaza. We want them somewhere else. Where? Sub-Saharan Africa, South America, take them anywhere. We want to take that territory. And just as we have found out recently, by the way, to the credit of the Israeli press, as well as the international press and the United Nations, that starving, sexual violence, torture, all of these things are part of the campaign of ethnic cleansing. Okay. Similarly, in this part, this was taking place, and there were officials, Serbian nationalist fanatics, who were anti-Muslim, of course, who made no secret of it. They made no secret that they would never bow down to Muslim authority in Bosnia and Herzegovina, that they were going to prevail over these people. They did not regard them as equal. So they did not want any kind of power sharing and coexistence the way it existed under Tito. This is not, by the way, those of you who have, I'm sure you have studied the history of Yugoslavia from 1918 all the way through Tito and after and Milosevic, you know that there was a hierarchy of ethnicities. Some were regarded higher, others lower. And this is not to say that everything that Yugoslavia was a panacea under Tito. I don't want to leave you with that impression at all. However, there was a sense of harmony and unity, and we didn't have this sort of thing taking place. Now, the Western powers, in their defense, have pointed out that, well, they bombed. The U.S. actually was suggesting bombing some of the Serbian targets, military targets, to dissuade them from continuing the conflict and so forth. That did not dissuade them at all. The fact is that the campaign to ethnic cleanse continued. It took place in July. They were watching it, I believe, from Vienna, Austria. There were CIA officers, if I'm not mistaken, included, but there were a number of people that were privy to that. They shared the intelligence with governments throughout Northwest Europe that this is taking place. They knew it was taking place while it was taking place. And just like Gaza, did nothing. And not only that, but adding insult to injury, they then demanded that the Bosnian leadership give up a lot of concessions, territorial as well as power concessions, to the Serbian side after during the Dayton Accords. So there was that. Now the French foreign minister said at one point, "We knew Serbs were sparing no lives of Muslims. They did nothing." Alain Juppé was honest enough to admit what all of the Western governments knew, that the genocide was taking place, but they did nothing. Ratko Mladić, Radovan Karadzic, and Milosevic were all convicted, along with 43 others, and that brought an end to it. And of course, the Dayton Accords did bring about the end of this war. The legacy of Srebrenica lives on in Gaza, except that in Gaza there is an adamant opposition to any kind of resolution, which is, of course, the two-state solution that the UN and a number of Arab governments and others have, China and Russia and so forth, have endorsed. In the case of Israel, there is a blank check to proceed as it sees fit, and to only stop when there is a threat of a massive regional war, as it was recently, when Israel and the United States were launched a bombing of Iran, and Iran returned the favor with its own ballistic missiles in Haifa and Tel Aviv. among other places, by the way. And then there was a fear that this would spread, as China and Russia made it very clear that it would either stop or they would have to take sides. And they're both on the side of Iran, although there are questions to what degree they would go to bat for Iran. I want to have some concluding remarks with a famous quote of the French philosopher, existentialist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre, who was realistic enough to point out that unfortunately, international law, international justice, and social justice are not carried out because as the case as it should be, because the great powers prevail and place their geopolitical and geoeconomic interests above everything else, above human life, including when it comes to genocide. Jean-Paul Sartre noted that the tribunal of conscience seeks to document and expose criminals against humanity. Well, as a philosophical point, and that sounds great, but in reality, that is not enough because human lives are lost, and it is no consolation to have a tribunal of conscience rather than a mechanism, an institutional mechanism at the international level that is effective to stop genocide from taking place again. The never again, which is a slogan, and rightly so, of Holocaust victims who survived and argued never again, and their children and grandchildren utter that, should be universal. It should be never again for anyone to suffer under genocide, not just never again for a specific group of people, but for all people on the planet. These Bosnia-Herzegovina Muslims have as much right to the never again slogan as Israelis, as the Jews, who rightly so said it for the German Holocaust, as do the Rohingyas in Myanmar. All people have the same right to that because the Geneva Convention of 1949 doesn't specify which people on the planet are covered under the Geneva Convention, the United Nations Geneva Convention. It doesn't say these people are covered and all the rest are excluded. It's everyone on this planet. So on the anniversary of this tragedy, one hopes that genocide will never take place again, and that while it is taking place now in Gaza, it will cease, and that the only instrument to bring it to an end is the United Nations. However, the United Nations is powerless when there is one country, the United States, and on occasion, some of its European partners would side with the United States that use veto power to make sure that the genocide doesn't stop. The humanity is judged by its constructive accomplishments, not by mass destruction. On the anniversary of Srebrenica, the lesson is never again for all humanity, whether they're Muslims, Christian, Jews, or whatever, Hindus, whatever they are. And this is the only lesson that should be left with us, not punishing those who merely expose the facts about what happens in conditions of genocide in any part of the world, regardless of who is involved. I'm going to thank you for tuning in. I'm going to ask you to write comments and to please join this channel. Thank you very much.